Hello, so I'll share my screen. The lecture this week touches on the article from your syllabus, which is called Can a Raped Woman Be Believed? And it is about Andrea Dworkin's articles that were published in The Guardian, The New Statesman, which documented a narrative or her writing about being raped in Paris in a hotel. So the author of the article is Tanya Cerisier at Birkbeck College, University of London. And this is a clip of
So
Dr. Cerisier discussing this master's program in criminology with the gender, sexuality, and criminal justice pathway. So some of you might be interested in graduate school, and you could consider studying at Birkbeck, which is a part of the University of London in London, England. And this is one program at Birkbeck, which is about gender, sexuality, and criminal justice.
I mainly work on kind of feminist politics and looking, I suppose, differently at sexual violence and how we might reduce sexual violence. So looking at the kind of cultural and social structures that underpin and enable it. And that's really where I've, focused my work in the last few years and kind of. So I mainly work on kind of feminist politics and looking, I suppose, differently at sexual violence and how we might reduce sexual violence. So looking at the kind of.
All right, for some reason my screen keeps pausing, so I'll try again, please.
So I mainly work on kind of feminist politics and looking, I suppose, differently at sexual violence and how we might reduce sexual violence. So looking at the kind of cultural and social structures that underpin and enable it. And that's really where I've, focused my work in the last few years and kind of what I'll be teaching you about if you come.
I'll be teaching on intersectionality and a lot of the issues that discussed before around the interplay between state violence and interpersonal violence. And wider than that, I'll be incorporating lots of examples, not just from the US, but more expanded than that of intersectional feminist theory, from Claudia Jones, who you might know from founding the Notting Hill Carnival, to the Organisation of Women in African and Asian Descent, an organisation founded in the 80s, all the way through to the Bromwich strike in West London, where Asian women withdrew their labour in the fight against sexism, racism, and labour exploitation. So lots of varied examples of intersectional theory and thought from the US, but also from here in the UK and Europe more broadly.
And I teach one of the core modules on the stream and the pathway, which is gender, sexuality, and criminal justice. And in that course, we basically ask, why haven't we made more progress around reducing interpersonal and sexual violence? And how might we think about those problems differently? And I also do research I'm interested in questions of gender and sexuality and imprisonment, both how gender and sexuality shape and influence the way in which the prison is run and structured and institutionalized. But I'm also interested in questions around our kind of punitive investments culturally outside of the prison and more broadly, why, how kind of punitive cultures get manifest through sexual and gender politics.
Yeah, I guess what's quite interesting about Birkbeck's approach to understanding these issues is that it's quite expansive in understanding issues around race and class and gender and disability, and how they intersect with at the individual level, but also at the state level. So I think what's interesting about Birkbeck's approach is that it brings all of these different facets into the analysis, which can be quite unusual in a lot of other places. So, I mean, an example of that, when we're thinking about how anti-violence research can intersect with looking at between state and interpersonal violence, You know, we can look at examples like immigration requirements that make migrant women dependent on their husbands, which exacerbate power differentials, with some men actually weaponizing the threat of deportation as a form of control in and of itself. And with the hostile environment in immigration, that has meant that perpetrators' threat to have their partners deported is actually being actualized by the state. So we've got 50% of police forces in the UK having a policy of arresting domestic or sexual violence survivors if they're known to be undocumented. And examples like this can really help to tease out the intersections between state violence and violence at the interpersonal level, and how they reinforce each other, how they support each other, and what the experiences of that can be for those who are experiencing that kind of oppression.
I think what's connected with that is, just this expansive view, looking at the things that we don't normally look at. So, when we talk about domestic and sexual violence or the overrepresentation of men, that we're not going to stand back and say, oh, this is just about, a group of bad men, and usually who do those men happen to be? They happen to be men who are socially marginalized, excluded, but we need to look at these bigger questions. What is it about our society's ideas of masculinity? What is it about the way that our society conducts relationships and teaches people to conduct relationships and, to conduct sexual relationships that means that they're so associated with violence? And again, this hidden thing, why don't we talk about it? When we talk about crime rates, we don't include crimes that occur in the home, like domestic violence. We're talking about things that occur on the streets. And so why do we separate these things out and make something seem kind of normalized and unspoken? And I think you're right, we have to look in that expansive way to really understand it.
One of the strengths, I think, of the program is that there is a real commitment to kind of theoretically informed but empirically grounded work. So we have scholars that specialize in queer theory and feminist theory and critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and are bringing that kind of theoretical perspective to bear on very concrete, specific problems. So we also have a lot of connections with community groups and activist organizations, and there's a kind of real interest in kind of questions of social justice and how do we do our research work in a way that is trying to address the problems of violence or the problems of inequality in the criminal justice system. What has been wrong with the current approach, or how could we do things differently, or how might we need to think about the problems in a completely different way in order to try and shift how we're dealing with those things.
So that is a clip about this master's program in it's in criminology with the gender, sexuality, and criminal justice pathway. So I'll play the clip about Andrea Dworkin after I discuss Dworkin and the article first. So Andrea Rita Dworkin was an American radical feminist writer and activist, best known for her analysis of pornography. Her feminist writings, beginning in 1974, spanned 30 years. They are found in a dozen solo works, 9 books of nonfiction, 2 novels, and a collection of short stories. Another 3 volumes were co-written or co-edited with U.S. constitutional law professor and feminist activist Catherine A. McKinnon. Central objective of Dworkin's work is analyzing Western society, culture, and politics through the prism of men's sexual violence against women in a patriarchal context. She wrote on a wide range of topics, including the lives of Joan of Arc, Margaret Haddon Trio, and Nicole Brown Simpson. She analyzed the literature of Charlotte Bronte, Jean Rhys, Leo Tolstoy, Marquis de Sade, Kobo Abe, Tennessee Williams, James Baldwin, and Isaac Bashevis Singer. She brought her own radical feminist perspective to her examination of subjects historically written or described from men's point of view, including fairy tales, homosexuality, lesbianism, virginity, anti-Semitism, the state of Israel, the Holocaust, biological superiority, and racism. She interrogated premises underlying concepts such as freedom of the press and liberties. She theorized the sexual politics of intelligence, fear, courage, and integrity. She described male supremacist political ideology manifesting in and constituted by rape, battery, prostitution, and pornography. So, Dr. Srizia's article discusses the politics of belief. And in reading the article, what I thought was central to the lack of disbelief was class antagonism against Andrea Dworkin, who was a very successful Jewish American feminist. And she was an American feminist, and her father was the grandson of a Russian Jew who fled Russia when he was 15 years old in order to escape military service. And her mother was the child of Jewish immigrants from Hungary. And this is from the Andrea Rita Dworkin Wikipedia entry. And unfortunately, Andrea Dworkin died in 2005. So I would argue that the denial is about a sense of class antagonism and perhaps anti-Semitism against Andrea Dworkin. And I'm going to try to contextualize rape in relation to histories of slavery, white supremacy, and anti-Semitism. So the narrative was met with widespread public statements of doubt and disbelief, including by many feminist commentators. Dworkin claimed to be saddened but unsurprised by the reactions. If the Holocaust can be denied even today, she is reported to have said, how can a woman who has been raped be believed? So this idea of a woman who was raped and how they can be believed, I think, is also central to the denial of anti-Semitism and the denial of systemic racism. I would argue that many people in the global north live in a constant state of denial about how racist the global north is and how much abuse non-white women and people must tolerate in comparison to other places where one would be part of the normal or mainstream middle class. So Sarah Ahmed writes, if whiteness gains its currency by going unnoticed, what does it mean to notice whiteness? And I think what is interesting is to notice white feminism. And when these authors who are white women disbelieve Andrea Dworkin, who has written about being raped, I think that this disbelief should be thought of as white feminism and should be thought of in relation to the normative presumptions of white settler women. Judgments of texts such as whether they are reliable or true are always influenced by what Ansgar Nunning describes as normative presumptions. This is particularly true for narratives of sexual violence, which are highly contested and ideologically charged. So in order to believe that sexual violence is actually quite normal, one would perhaps have to believe that anti-Semitism and systemic racism and settler colonialism are actually normal functionings of everyday life in predominantly white Western countries. And I think that this is difficult to believe if one wants to think that people have been saved by the global north, or that women of color are being abused only by men of color and not by state power, or not because of histories of slavery or and the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and settler colonialism. Dworkin's account, along with other rape narratives, can therefore be seen to sit between two different generic standards of truth-telling: a legal standard with an emphasis on factual truth and external verifiability, and a feminist one with an emphasis on subjective or experiential truth and markers of authenticity. Narrators and readers of these texts must therefore navigate between different and ideologically opposed criteria of believability, making evaluations of texts highly conditional on the normative presumptions that readers bring to them. Theories of autobiography have emphasized the vulnerability and risks faced by autobiographical narrators as they seek to construct an autobiographical self and have that self recognized. In narratives of trauma, this vulnerability is enhanced both by the difficulty of telling and the potential for the original trauma to be compounded if a narrative is disbelieved or rejected. And I think this idea of belief is also about investment in the workings of state power. Many people of color I've met, especially people who are part of the South Asian diaspora, do not want to believe that there is any racism. Maybe in North America, maybe in the world, because it's a perfect world. With perfect families and perfect moms and dads and perfect white neighbors. It's just perfect. I think that this sense of kind of ridiculous denial is really common among lots of settlers in context of settler colonialism, that many settlers refuse to believe that other settlers have caused problems, and therefore they perhaps do not believe that settler colonialism is a problem. And this, I think, leads to crimes. And I think many people commit crimes against women and girls and transgender people and queer people constantly. And I think that people of color, and specifically people of color who align themselves with Judeo-Christian family values and settler colonial mythology, often do not like women and girls and transgender people and queer people who tell the truth about criminal behavior, including rape and sexual harassment and sexual violence, and discrimination because of systemic racism and ableism and any other kind of negative truth that is really about holding powerful people, including powerful men and women, cisgender, heterosexual people, accountable for their violations of the law. I think that this historical capacity to just lie boldly without any shame could be traced back to the caste system in many cases, and the great immigrant family who perhaps committed a lot of crimes to become the great immigrant family and to then settle people's land again. In 19th century common law, writes Saidiya Hartman, rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a female against her will and without her consent. Yet the actual or attempted rape of an enslaved woman was an offense neither recognized nor legislated by law. So if we were to compare this to the caste system, in the 1970s, the Mandel Commission reforms changed laws regarding caste in India, and many people's parents or grandparents might have still benefited from caste discrimination and from human slavery and from the abuse of Dalit Bahujan women and Dalit Bahujan people. And so the law then changed, but the question is whether or not anyone ever has to follow the law. And so if you're interested in criminology, you might be interested in looking at these laws regarding caste, and specifically the Mandel Commission. And the Mandel Commission, established in 1979, aimed to identify socially or educationally backward classes. Headed by B.P. Mandel, it submitted its report in 1980. And the report found that 52% of India's population comprised OBCs, other backward classes. So in 1979, 52% of India's population was not upper caste. And the Mandel Commission led to affirmative action for people to redress caste discrimination. And so it was an attempt to use law to create affirmative action for people who are discriminated because of the caste system. And I think that the construction of these categories of immigrants and then people of color can be thought of in historical terms. In very nuanced ways. Firstly, the Mandel Commission was set up in 1979. So people who are of my parents' generation immigrated before the passage of affirmative action. And so they could have perhaps benefited from the caste system. However, when they immigrated to a country like Canada, they entered a country that had historically excluded people of color from claiming full citizenship and wanted to create a country of white Christian and Catholics, and predominantly just white people everywhere, white people having babies, white people being white people everywhere. So obviously, this is a really nuanced experience of, on the one hand, benefiting from discrimination against others and really horrible forms of discrimination, and then not benefiting from the privileges of being white. I would argue that denial of sexism and denial of racism, particularly against women of color, is central to the model minority myth. And the model minority myth is a myth in which Asian and South Asian people are included in countries with long histories of anti-Black racism and anti-indigeneity. And model minorities are people who are supposed to work arduously, never complain about racism, and have successful, happy, healthy middle-class families. And in order for the model minority myth to be sustained, South Asian women must never complain. And this kind of behavior is something that I think that exists in many immigrant families and diasporas, that people are more likely, I think, who are part of this model minority myth, to be extremely rude to their family members, to their daughters and their wives, and never to politicize any labor exploitation. So this history then of lying about sexual violence and rape is central to the exploitation of labor, and Saidiya Hartman discusses how rape was central to slavery. In 19th century common law, rape was defined as the forcible carnal knowledge of a female against her will and without her consent. Yet the actual or attempted rape of an enslaved woman was an offense neither recognized nor legislated by law. Rape was not simply unimaginable because of purported Black lasciviousness, but its repression was essential to the displacement of white culpability that characterized both the recognition of Black humanity in slave law and the designation of the Black subject as the originary locus of transgression and offense. The cases of State of Missouri versus Celia and George versus State averred that the enslaved in general and captive women in particular were not appropriate subjects of common law and thus not protected against rape. So the normalization of rape and sexual violence was central to holding women captive so that they could work as slaves. And this kind of normalization of gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, I think is central to keeping labor exploitation going. I think that if domestic violence and sexual violence and child abuse against girls and against transgender and queer children were taken seriously, then labor exploitation would not be as prevalent. From a psychological perspective, once you dehumanize somebody and you make it possible for someone to think of themselves as not being worthy of bodily integrity, then you can exploit somebody's labor until they are dead. So Hartman discusses how the rape of enslaved women was not an offense in either common law or slave statute. However, the repression or abasement of rape can only in part be explained by the inapplicability of common law to the enslaved. Rather, the repression and negation of this act of violence is central, not only to the pained constitution of Blackness, but to the figuration and the deployment of sexuality in the context of captivity. The disavowal of rape most obviously involves issues of consent, agency, and will, which are ensnared in a larger dilemma concerning the construction of person and the calculation of Black humanity in slave law. Moreover, this repression of violence constitutes female gender as the locus of both unredressed and negligible injury. The dual invocation of person and property made issues of consent, will, and agency complicated and ungainly. Yet the laws strive to contain the tensions generated by this seemingly contradictory invocation of the enslaved as property and person, as absolutely subject to the will of another and an actional subject by recourse to the power of feelings, the mutual affection between master and slave, and the strength of weakness, the ability of the dominated to influence, if not control, the dominant. Just as the dual invocation of the slave as property and person was an effort to wed reciprocity and submission, intimacy and domination, the legitimacy of violence, and the necessity of protection, so too the law's nullification of the captive's ability to give consent or act as agent and the punitive recognition and or stipulation of agency as criminality reproduced the double bind of bifurcated subject and intensified the burdened personhood of the chattel person. So this is research that I've done, and I'm reading my research. Much like wearing makeup, it's work. I wasn't born with, I don't know, I guess I didn't inherit the genes of a rich millionaire. So this is from research I've done, which is work. So what is interesting about Hartman's article is that it moves from discussing the ways that slaves could never be raped because it would interfere with ownership and the capacity to work. And the capacity to work then becomes about ownership of a person. And then enslaved women end up having the capacity to make claims of rape if they are property. And if they're someone's property, they cannot be raped by another. And this is really central to how rape law has been formed. Everywhere in the world. I would argue that the idea of being a woman who is married to a man would perhaps allow one to make a claim that would be taken seriously if you were raped by someone who was not your husband. India is a country where marital rape still exists. And I think that it is also central that marital rape exists because caste-based marriages are still common. The Mandel Commission reforms added affirmative action to Indian law, but marital systems are still organized through caste. And so constructing women as property, not only of one group of men, but as property of every group of men, turns rape into a crime that it is against men and against male property owners of women. And I think one of the reasons that certain people's claims of being raped are not believed is because of this historical equation between property ownership and the bodies of wives who are imagined to be owned by husbands. And this is why I think that many transgender and queer people might not be believed or might experience sexual violence and not even report this violence to police. And I do think it is about the history of the law. The law can obviously change, but the question is, does someone's mentality change? And Tanya Cerisier's article is really about continued disbelief, even in the year 2000, even in 2000, even now. I think this tone of disbelief, of not wanting to empathize with women, is really about misogyny and the ways that misogyny often makes any narrative of a free woman impossible to hear. And obviously intersectionality leads to misogynoir and specific forms of misogyny against Indigenous women, trans women, women of color, disabled women. But at the core, I think this sense of not being a free person whose legal rights matter as a free person is still with us. And I would argue it is also central to labor and how labor and money are imagined in gender terms. So Hartman writes, if the legal existence of the crime of rape depends upon evaluating the mens rea and actus rea of the perpetrator, and more importantly, the consent or non-consent of the victim, then how does one grapple with issues of consent and will when the negation or restricted recognition of these terms determine the meaning of enslavement? So this idea of consent and will for Hartman are obviously complicated by histories of slavery, which then lead to histories of poverty or labor exploitation. Does anyone really consent to work? Does somebody want to work? Does somebody want to be in a relationship with another person, or is it because of money that they're forced into certain relationships? Even the idea of immigration, if countries in the global south were places where things worked, where the economy worked, where there was queer rights or trans rights, would people want to immigrate? So these ideas of consent and will are complicated by Hartman in this article. If the commonplace understanding of will implies the power to control and determine our actions and identifies the expressive capacity of the self-possessed and intending subject, certainly this is far afield of the conditions and terms of action available to the enslaved. Yet the notion of the will connotes more than simply the capacity to act and do. Rather, it distinguishes the autonomous agent from the enslaved, encumbered, and constrained. So then we come back to this idea of consent. Would somebody want to work if they were treated fairly, if they could buy whatever they want to buy, and then they could have personal relationships using the products that they have bought, and their personal relationships would not be the subject of conversation among people they work with or among the public, and they would be their own personal things, just as the things that they buy with their money would be their own and they would own title to copyright, then perhaps people would want to work. But the history of labor has never been a history of free people selling their labor. The history of labor in India is obviously a history of caste discrimination. The history of gendered labor has never been a history of free people selling their labor. Lipstick was actually considered to be contraband and was banned by the British Empire. And it was banned historically by the British because British people worried that poor and working class women who had the right to work would buy lipstick and entice middle class men to be in relationships with them because of this amazing lipstick. And then a family who was part of a certain class in England would end up having to give some of their money to a woman who married their son, who was not a middle class British woman. I would argue that these anxieties are still with us today, and they're anxieties of class antagonism and intermixture, and they could be even anxieties of eugenics and impurity because of religion and race. So the concept of rape and disbelief is very complicated, and Andrea Dworkin was an American writer, and the case of Emmett Till is one of the most widely cited cases in legal theory and in Black feminist theory, and it's often cited by feminists who are interested in the politics of sexual violence and the question of justice. So Emmett Louis Till was an African-American boy who was abducted, tortured, and lynched in Mississippi in 1955 at the age of 14 after being accused of offending a white woman, Carol Bryant, in her family's grocery store. So in another account, Emmett Till was actually accused of trying to rape Carol Bryant, and this case is one of many cases in which there are competing testimonies about Emmett Till, and many historians have argued that Emmett Till did not do anything that was against the law to Carolyn Bryant, and he was lynched because he was Black. And so the justification for the killing of Black children and Black male children could have been supposed assaults against white women, but this was often done in the 1940s and 50s, and many would argue that disbelief involves legal reason and fairness. And in order to be fair, one cannot simply believe every narrative. So Andrea Dworkin writes about Holocaust denial in discussing how she was not believed as someone who was raped. And Dr. Cerizier's article discusses this kind of historical denial. In the quotation that refers to the Holocaust, she refers to herself as a woman who has been raped and disbelieved, referencing silencing, erasure, and rewriting of women's accounts of sexual violence that has been well documented by feminists. So what is really noteworthy about the article, Can a Raped Woman Be Believed, is that it looks at all the ways that belief and our capacity to believe is about histories of denial, belief, and law. So historically, the Holocaust was denied by the Nazis, and now it is quite common knowledge that the Holocaust did happen. Jewish people are persecuted. However, it is quite common knowledge that slavery also happened, and that slavery historically was responsible for not only the persecution and enslavement of Black people, but the killing of Black people and the rape of Black women. So Andrea Dworkin's history and personal history as a Jewish woman, I think, are central to why certain people can believe her and cannot. And I think this is also true of anti-Black racism against Black women, or misogynoir, that depending upon our understanding of history and how we understand history, we might choose to believe certain narratives or not. And it is possible that people do not believe historical narratives of Jewish women who wrote extensively about being abused and raped during the Holocaust. It is possible that people do not believe Black women's histories of sexual violence. And so the law is quite clear, though, that anti-Semitism is against the law, anti-Black racism is against the law, and rape is against the law. So one's personal beliefs do not have to correspond with law, but when you act upon your beliefs, or when you sound like somebody who does not believe in the law, then it is, I think, quite troubling to those who do believe that historical atrocities have happened, and they have led to the rape of many Jewish women and women of color. The analogy both confers the moral legitimacy of victimhood on Dworkin and formulates the act of disbelief as normatively suspect. Her account of the disbelief of others is one in which she has been wronged, both through a direct act of violence and the denial of her account of that violence. It is this second harm that makes the betrayal of her so-called sisters unbearable. For Dworkin, emphasizing both that readers have agency around questions of belief and that their judgments are inflected by social norms and relations of power. So sexual violence was prevalent during the Holocaust, and I think that disbelief of certain women and certain people who tell stories or who write stories about sexual violence could also be about a wider set of ideologies that might not involve naming whiteness or the privileges of whiteness and might not involve an understanding of white feminism as being really traumatic in the lives of others. During World War II, some Jewish men and women in concentration camps faced sexual violence due to wartime discrimination, anti-Semitism, and genocidal conditions, among other reasons. This discrimination happened both inside concentration camps run by Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime and also outside of the camps. This sexual violence and discrimination happened not only in Germany, but throughout Europe in areas that the Germans occupied during the war. Outside of concentration camps, sexual violence happened in many places, including but not limited to Jewish people's homes, Jewish hiding spaces, in public and in killing sites. There were more than 44,000 camps and sites for incarceration, which were under the control of the Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. The origins of the sexual abuse and segregation of Jewish men and women was primarily due to their race. The Nazis used these sites for a variety of reasons, such as forced physical and sexual labor from their prisoners. There are many accounts from both men and women survivors, but oftentimes there is an erasure due to the topic's nature and stereotypes and stigmas around the experiences. Gender-based violence, sexual violence, and anti-Semitic viewpoints contributed to the maltreatment and violence against Jewish men and women during the Holocaust. So sexual violence during the Holocaust was quite common, and Andrea Dworkin's narrative of being raped, I think, must be thought of as reaching an audience in a certain historical time. So in a different time, the fact that Andrea Dworkin was Jewish might have been central to understanding her as a victim of sexual violence, and as someone who was really concerned with rape and sexual violence against women. However, over time, this kind of refusal to name race, I think, allows for certain women to be discriminated against and believed without the language of anti-Semitism, anti-Black racism, and white supremacy and white privilege to be named. So there have been authors who have discussed that we are living in a post-racial time, and I think that this language is extremely dangerous and quite self-serving. And when Donald Trump became the president of the United States of America, there was a resurgence in neo-Nazism, swastikas were used, crimes of anti-Semitism are still quite normal, or not normal, but still quite prevalent. And from the perspective of statistics, it isn't surprising that these crimes exist, and it isn't surprising, I guess, that neo-Nazis still exist. Rape involving both Jewish and non-Jewish women, men, and children occurred during the Second World War. Rape occurred in homes, in hiding, in ghettos, in prisons, in brothels, and in concentration camps. Many were raped by those in positions of authority, although some Jewish women were raped by collaborators or rescuers, as well as by other Jews. And this kind of historical narrative of rape is actually quite common. And I think that the refusal to believe Andrea Dworkin is also about a refusal to remember the Holocaust, to remember one's implication in white supremacy, anti-Semitism, genocide, and the killing of people who are not Christian and not white. And I think it's specifically common for settlers in North America and for white settler people and for white settler women to constantly deny their privileges of skin color and name while continuing to participate in what has been referred to as a genocide against Indigenous people and against Indigenous women and girls. Some surviving women reported rapes that they had witnessed. Testimonies often mention the event but do not elaborate on them. Memories may be too painful or embarrassing to recall. Society has not acknowledged such experiences during the Holocaust, and interviewers are reluctant to delve into such personal injuries. Rape is increasingly recognized as a weapon of war, and not only as a spoil of war. Modern genocides, such as those in Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, have clearly incorporated rape into their actions, and rape is increasingly recognized and examined as part of these wars. A few Holocaust survivors remain to tell their stories, and as even fewer of them will have experienced rape, this aspect of the Holocaust will probably remain unknown. So, this language of not being believed is perhaps why many Jewish women and women of color, immigrant women, would not share stories of sexual violence with predominantly white women. So I'll play this clip from this film, My Name is Andrea. I really liked Andrea Dworkin's writing, and I am sorry that she passed away. I also don't think that Andrea Dworkin is funny or comical. She wrote extensively about rape, and the first book I wrote was about a gang rape case of a woman in India who was believed by the government of India, and 5 men got the most harsh penalty, which was death.
Hey, ABC 12 Radio time is 10:18. I'm Michael Jackson. What a mind our guest possesses. What powerful thought she has to express and how well she does it. Her work is read and respected in many countries, respected for her hard stance against pornography, an eloquent proponent of a woman's rights to bodily integrity and respect. She's Andrea Dworkin. Are you angry?
Am I angry? I think I'm probably patient and calm and cool and gentle and relatively kind. I'm outraged. I'm outraged that women are treated the way we are in this society. I think it's wrong. I want it changed. She knew how much.
Andrea Dworkin was a really successful writer who wrote many, many books and co-edited publications with Catherine McKinnon, who is a legal scholar. And this idea that Andrea Dworkin is angry, I mean, would it be possible to be someone who is so filled with rage and to write so many books and to have such a successful career? The kind of use of psychology and name calling by journalists and commentators, I think, is about class antagonism. Andrea Dworkin was a very successful person who knew how to do business and knew how to write. And so it's interesting to think about the use of this kind of language against Andrea Dworkin and the historical use of this kind of psychologizing or personality assessment. The idea that someone is an angry woman has also been used historically against Black women and, yes, Jewish women who had successful careers and could actually write something.
First it was to be a woman. She knew that one had to survive many desolations and injuries. One had to be both bloodied and bowed, but one had to keep writing anyway. Through it, despite it, because of it, around it, in it, under it, goddamn.
Well, I'll play this other clip, which is about the film called My Name is Andrea.
Once again, I'm Betsy Moore, Director of Programs at the Jewish Women's Archive, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight Dr. Beth Harmer. Welcome.
Hi, really nice to see you there. Wish I could be there in person, but there we go.
Well, thank you for being here this way. It is an honor to talk to you as the writer and director of this incredible film, My Name is Andrea. I wanted to start out by asking you, what drew you to Andrea Dworkin as a subject for a film?
I, would never ever have imagined I would make a film about Andrea Dworkin. But the idea got planted in my head by a couple of producers here in the UK. And I was like, oh, I don't know, I don't think so, but let me read her work. And so I actually read two of her books. I read Mercy, and I read her memoir, Heartbreak. And that's kind of, completely turned me around. I really fell in love with the words on the page. I fell in love with her as a writer, and also her life story. The fact that here was a woman who had a deep desire to be a poet and a writer, yet at every turn in her life, that desire had been thwarted. And I could see, that there are parallels for so many women in the world who want to, embody their desires, live out their, dreams of being writers or whatever, poets. And, there are so many things along the way that stops women physically from being able to do that. And so I just thought her story was fascinating. She was fascinating. And also, I think one of the other things was that what I knew of her was that she had been so incredibly misrepresented. And I discovered a whole other Andrea. And so I wanted to make a film where other people could discover this whole other Andrea too.
Well, I can certainly say that from my point of view, you were incredibly successful in doing so. I learned so much about Andrea's work, and even as someone who is a scholar of this period of feminism, it was remarkable seeing the footage you found, the recordings of her voice. What surprised you the most? What did you feel like was most striking to you as something that was true about Andrea Dworkin that was not known and that was misrepresented in her public image?
Gosh, so many things. I think one of the things that I was really surprised by, in a really good way, was the way in which her feminism had been completely and totally shaped by so many other historical, social, political movements, so that it was her involvement in the anti-Vietnam War movement, her awareness of and being active in the civil rights movement, and her reading of African American intellectual thinkers and political thinkers, she also was in correspondence with Huey Newton about poetry at one time, and reading James Baldwin, and then Frantz Fanon. And those were the things that really surprised me, that I didn't know that she had. Those were her formative people, formative thought leaders. And I think that the depth of her intellectual thinking, the depth of her engagement philosophically with the bigger questions about existence and about life and about equality, fundamentally about equality, and why her guiding question really always was, why are women not seen as fully human? And I think that's those were the things that really surprised me about her.
I was so struck in the film by her drive toward humanity, toward her own humanity and toward the humanity of others. And it's something that you see in a number of stories of women who were part of the second wave of feminism, that they had aspirations that they saw as human that were then thwarted by their womanhood and by the patriarchal response to their womanhood. And her drive toward humanity was so striking in that way, and I really appreciated your pulling that out. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the research process for this film. How did you go about finding the footage and clips and documents that you drew on?
We had, first of all, the producer, Shaheen Haq, is an incredible sleuth, and she found a lot of the archival footage. But also we came to Boston, and we spent a week looking through Andrea Dworkin's archives at Radcliffe. They were very, very helpful. And I hope some of them are there in the audience tonight to see when we were demanding some of those archival images, etc., what we finally ended up using them as. And so, it was a combination of Dworkin's archives and her papers, but also doing a whole other research, archival research also. And John Stoltenberg, he was incredibly helpful by opening up the home movies footage.
We'll stop there. If there's a chance, we could watch the whole documentary if we can get a copy of it. But for now, I'll leave these clips, and if you have a chance, you can watch the full interview with the filmmaker. One of the unfortunate things that the article makes one consider is that women often do not believe other women who report rape and sexual violence. And Tanya Cerisier discusses gendered doxa, and what the author is interested in, from my own interpretation of the text, is that the way that an existing gendered framework makes a narrative of gender-based violence a phobic object for mainstream audiences. And so if we were to think about this article in relation to Halberstam's writing regarding heteronormative temporality, then many people are afraid of telling the truth about ruptures in heteronormative time, even if they are truths that someone has the right to tell as a person with legal rights who is a victim of crime. A gendered doxa is really about societal opinion. So the word doxa is modeled on an ancient Greek word meaning opinion, what is said of things or people. And so the doxa is really about public opinion and societal reputation. And within this gendered doxa, one would think that commentators would place the blame on those who were accused of sexual violence. But unfortunately, because of misogyny and because of, I think, histories of the use of rape by state power and by different groups of affluent white men to seize the land and to organize labor, I think that in many instances, women, and specifically Jewish women, poor working class women, transgender women, women of color, Black and Indigenous women are often not believed. And they are specifically, I think, not believed by other women who might be in positions of authority or power. And what is interesting about Andrea Dworkin and this refusal to believe Andrea Dworkin, or to believe her narrative, and the kind of commentary that constantly referred in the press to Andrea Dworkin as quote unquote crazy, is also commentary that was used against Andrea Dworkin, who is a Jewish woman who is more successful and perhaps had more money, and whose name was more memorable and still is more memorable and will always be more memorable than many white Christian women. And I would argue this kind of refusal to believe is a choice that one can make. So many people could not choose to be Andrea Dworkin. Many people could not choose to be a successful writer. They could not choose to make the money that Andrea Dworkin made, but they could choose just to not believe her or to call her names. And I think this is also about class antagonism against Jewish women, and specifically very successful Jewish women like Andrea Dworkin. The extreme nature of reactions to Dworkin indicates the importance of normative or ideological context for the evaluation of autobiographical texts. This context is broadly framed by the set of shared norms or beliefs that Roland Barthes referred to as doxa. These beliefs structure our understanding of everyday happenings and our judgments of the reliability, both factual and normative, of autobiographical and other factual texts. I would also argue that this search for mistakes in Dworkin's writing was not just about this one narrative. If you look at historical commentators, there was this search for kind of mistakes, and specifically white American commentators and white American Christian commentators and white American women Christian who were Christians, and were perhaps jealous of Andrea Dworkin's writing. This search for mistakes is also common if you look at the ways that white women historically have responded to Black women's narratives, and Black women's narratives about intersectional oppression. I would argue that the search for mistakes is a kind of high-class body shaming. So if someone was kind of 12, or maybe, I don't know, 16, they might actually look for and actually look at someone's body or image or name and kind of say really catty or disparaging things, but kind of skimming Andrea Dworkin's article and just saying, no, you're lying, is kind of a more adult, I guess, form of body shaming that does not really connote historical literacy or credibility. Applied to rape, these beliefs include both common sense understandings of how and under what circumstances rape occurs, and gendered beliefs about how women and men should and do behave. Hegemonic beliefs in this area are often referred to by feminists as rape myths because they often bear little direct relation to the realities of rape. For instance, there is a strong cultural belief that rapes are generally committed by violent strangers, whereas in reality, most sexual assaults occur between partners, acquaintances, and family members. So this gender doxa for Dworkin to be believed as someone who has written about rape, for the narrative to be believed, then we have to come back to this idea of assaults between acquaintances, partners, family members. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a prominent Supreme Court judge, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg was very influential and an exemplary, I think, model of American feminism and upholding the rights of American women as American women. So in addition to kind of jealous white women, many people might not want to believe that Andrea Dworkin exists as a person outside of an imagined ethnic or religious community where people do sexually assault free people. So these myths create an alternative reality which fractures and distorts women's experiences and narratives until they are virtually unrecognizable. For instance, Susan Ehrlich has documented the ways in which women's legal testimony of acquaintance rape may be rewritten as consensual sex. One way in which this is achieved is through applying an ideological framing of non-consent as requiring utmost resistance. This framing enables the categorization of women's verbal signs, such as asking an assailant to leave, as ineffectual or inadequate. So, Anya Cerisier also discusses cases of domestic violence and the ways that narratives of domestic violence are often rewritten. So Shauna Eltrinch demonstrates in her discussion of the ways in which the translation of Latina women's narratives of domestic violence from conversational accounts to legal documents in the form of applications for protective orders requires a series of erasures, substitutions, and reinscriptions. This risk is particularly pertinent for narrators such as Trinch's subjects, who could be classified as uncognizant of the rules and truth criteria of a genre which they are engaged. Cognizant narrators, on the other hand, could be defined as narrators who are aware of both the broad cultural doxa and the generic conventions that will be used to evaluate their narratives. These narrators will be better equipped to construct successful narrators and to move between genres. So this idea of having to construct a narrative to be believed is also about the criminal justice system. And I think it is also really just about the criminal justice system and trying to make money. Andrea Dworkin was a very successful writer and a famous commentator, a famous American feminist. And So not believing someone is also about them not supporting their career. And the criminal justice system is, I think, also about belief. So what the article really, I think, asked me to consider, or what I asked myself after reading it, was how much language is connected to belief. And if language is about belief, then is language really about justice? I mean, if one can narrate a very believable story in English, in very kind of complex academic terms, or not even complex academic terms, but almost a saleable narrative, like Hollywood celebrity or a commercial for one's victimization, then is this how the criminal justice system works? Is your experience of trauma or sexual violence or theft something that you have to then orchestrate a commercial about? And in the time of the internet, the answer might be yes, because a lot of court cases during the pandemic and a lot of legal work could actually be done online using Zoom. And it's possible that the kind of image that people put on the internet about themselves, the photos that you use, your internet branding, could all be kind of used to judge somebody as a person who deserves to make money, but also as a person who has legal claims to make or not. So the author for this week's readings then discuss all of the work that was done by second wave feminists. And they write that when second wave feminists turned their attention to rape in the 1960s, they began to challenge these common sense understandings of sex and violence, as can be seen in Susan Brown Miller's response to the Hale warning. Since 4 or 5 out of rapes go unreported, it is fair to say categorically that women do not find rape an accusation easily to be made. The article is kind of sad in many places. It's also really anger provoking, and I hope it's not too difficult to look at. We have reading week next week, and if you don't want to focus on this reading for your presentation or your final assignment, then you obviously don't have to look at any of the readings. But hopefully you will find it interesting to think about, particularly in relation to the other articles that we previously read. Gail Paulus's article about standpoint epistemology and intersubjectivity might lead us to think about the standpoint of the audience. And this is something that Tanya Cerisier comes back to in the article multiple times, is the audience. The standpoint of the audience can often determine their capacity to believe or to like a narrative. And the problem is, if we were to think about an audience, we can also think about a jury, and we can think about a judge and a lawyer. So they also argued that given the historical suspicion, denial, and reinscription that greeted women's narratives of rape, feminist readings should be based on an ethical presumption of belief. Finally, they argued that the law as it existed was an inadequate site to determine the truth of rape. This critique resulted in legal reforms aimed at altering legal truth criteria, or at least limiting its pernicious effects. Rape shield laws, which restrict the type of questions that lawyers were able to ask in cross-examination, are a useful example. This reform was an attempt to decenter the question of women's credibility and restrict the ways in which it could be undermined through tropes such as recklessness or promiscuity. So these ideas of credibility or perfect victims have been discussed by feminists throughout the world. the first book that I wrote was about the case of the gang rape and murder of Jyoti Singh. And Jyoti Singh was a 23-year-old student who went to the movies with her friend Awindra Pandey, and they caught a bus when they were leaving the movie, and a group of men had hijacked an off-duty bus and proceeded to pick up the couple. They then gang raped and murdered Jyoti Singh using a blunt object, which meant that the case could be characterized as torture. And they did kill Jyoti. She died in this Safdarjung hospital, or in a hospital, and I think that was the name of the hospital, but she died 2 weeks after the assault. She was 23. Awindra Pandey survived the attack. He was brutally beaten. The assailants stole his possessions. They also stole the couple's things. He did survive. And so this was a case of gang rape and murder. There are always also suspicions that surround these cases in India, and for any person who has ever been to India or lived in India, there were lots of suspicions involving other people who could have also been involved and conspired against Jyoti Singh. The courts found multiple men who were on this bus and were migrants and working class migrants to the city of Delhi to be guilty of rape and murder, and they were sentenced to death. So these tropes of credibility, I think, haunt all cases of sexual violence, gender-based violence, transphobic violence, rape narratives in India. The fact that Jyoti Singh was not a married woman, even the fact that she went to the movies, was something that the public discussed. If there had been alcohol involved, this would have been discussed in the media, and it might have affected the ruling in the case, irrespective of all of the evidence against the accused. So the author of this week's readings then discusses gendered doxa, which is a concept for one's societal reputation, one's gendered reputation. And I mean, the same kind of narratives of provocation, I think, are still with us, that if you are a woman who looks a certain way or drinks alcohol, goes out on your own, I guess that this can affect this gender doxa. So these transactions occur within wider social and generic sets of truth criteria, a fact understood by cognizant readers and narrators. Sets of truth criteria are not, however, ideologically neutral, but rely on hegemonic ideas of how the world is and how it should be. For women seeking to recount experiences of rape, the gendered doxa that surround their stories have often invalidated them, reinscribing them as, for instance, narratives of consensual sex. An orientation of suspicion towards rape narratives continues in contemporary society, seen in claims such as Bennett's that all rape narratives should be subject to scrutiny. This ideologically charged cultural framework around rape narratives must be accounted for in any narrative attempt to compel or establish belief. So the article is quite interesting. I think it is really sad in certain parts if you think that it is just called "Can a Raped Woman Be Believed?" And there is a lot of negative evidence to answer this title. I hope that the lecture is understandable. Sometimes I stutter for certain words because there are a lot of words, but I hope that it isn't too disruptive to understanding what I am trying to confer, which is just this idea of belief. And I think if you were to think about how, as a self, as a person, you try to kind of express yourself to others, the question would be, why are you not believed? Why will someone not believe you? And the answer can often be because to believe you would mean not believing in themselves. And Andrea Dworkin was a Jewish feminist who wrote very strongly against pornography, sexual violence, rape. And if one wants to believe in the kind of sanctity of tradition, the traditional Judeo-Christian heterosexual family, then perhaps one cannot believe Andrea Dworkin. So it's interesting to just consider if someone can believe you, and if they can believe you, perhaps their sense of identity and their sense of self and their sense of self-esteem would not be hurt if they believed you. And that is perhaps a person who could be your audience and your friend, and someone who could be your contemporary and who you could be in solidarity with. So an orientation to belief, however, is insufficient on its own. Conferring authority onto ideologically contested narratives requires critical engagement with doxa that operate to invalidate these narratives as inherently untruthful or irrational. These two ethical imperatives do not always align. This was seen in the discussion of Dworkin's narrative, but can also be seen in relation to Siebold's story. In the case of Dworkin's narrative, Grayson and Orr clearly sought to undertake an ethical reading of Dworkin's narrative, but refused to validate the factual accuracy of the account or its reproduction of harmful rape myths. And I would argue that I don't agree with what this author is writing. I don't think that their narrative could be objective. And I think the fact that Andrea Dworkin is Jewish, and many of Andrea Dworkin's kind of commentators were not Jewish, is central to how white women do not offer an ethical reading of non-white women's texts in many instances. There are many people who would not want to agree with me, who want to make a considerable amount of money and don't want to self-identify as being people of color, and that's fine, but I will still continue to think about Saidiya Hartman and her writings about slavery and the ways that the economy and who would be free to sell their labor and who would be enslaved and exploited, and who would also be free to give birth to free children, is central to how people think about rape in an extremely racist society like Canada and America. So I'll finish by discussing rape and abortion laws and the Dobbs ruling. So the Dobbs ruling overturned the Roe versus Wade precedent in the United States of America, and in several states in America, it is now an offense to have an abortion. And so after Roe versus Wade, there have been many cases in which women who were raped cannot have an abortion legally in the state they're from, or the state they were in when they were assaulted.
Research is showing just how much of an impact the overturning of Roe v. Wade has had on rape-related pregnancies. John Yang has more.
Amna, Polls show that about 7 in 10 Americans say abortion should be allowed in cases of rape or incest. But since the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade in 2022, 9 states have banned abortion, even in those cases. 5 others have exceptions for rape, but only in the very early stages of pregnancy or after the assault is reported to law enforcement. In a new study published this week in the Journal of the American Medical Association, researchers used government data on sexual violence to calculate that since the Supreme Court said states could regulate abortion however they want, there have been more than 64,000 rape-related pregnancies in jurisdictions with bans. They estimate that 26,000 of those were in Texas alone. Dr. Samuel Dickman is one of the study's co-authors. He's an abortion provider and the chief medical officer for Planned Parenthood of Montana. Dr. Dickman, is there anything in what you found in your study that surprised you?
Well, thank you, John. You know, the numbers are just shocking. We know that sexual assault is common, or at least people who work in the reproductive health world know that it's common, but seeing the scale of this problem, I mean, it was honestly horrifying when we conducted this study.
And you say in your report, or at least I take it you're saying that this could actually be an undercount.
Well, studying sexual assault and rape is notoriously challenging because it's such a stigmatized life event. So some people will never report that they were sexually assaulted, even on an anonymous survey. So that would cause our estimates to be too low. On the other hand, there are other assumptions that we have to make in a modeling study that might bias the estimates to be too high. So we think we use the best available data using published peer-reviewed research, but of course, these are just estimates.
Why did you undertake this study?
Well, I've been an abortion provider for years, and I've taken care of far too many patients who have come to me and told me that their pregnancy was a result of rape. And when I talk to my friends and colleagues around the country who work in abortion care and reproductive health, they told me the same thing. And our study was an attempt to try to figure out how common is that case where someone becomes pregnant as a result of rape.
As we mentioned, there are 5 states that do have exceptions for rape, but under very tight restrictions. Given those restrictions, how meaningful are those exceptions?
Those exceptions provide no meaningful abortion care for survivors of rape and sexual assault, full stop. There are no abortions happening for survivors of rape in states like Idaho that supposedly have exceptions for rape, but we know that because of the extremely burdensome criteria for obtaining an abortion, not just on the survivor, but on the medical provider, that providers are essentially telling those survivors of rape that they need to travel out of state or find somewhere else to go or continue a pregnancy that was a result of sexual violence.
I was going to ask that. There's no way of telling because these are estimates, but from your experience, what are these women doing who are pregnant because of rape and unable to get an abortion where they live?
Well, you know, I've taken care of patients who've driven hours with their family members from Idaho, who've flown from Texas because they weren't able to obtain abortions in those states. So I think some are able to make that incredibly challenging trip to travel out of state. But when I think about the patients I took care of in San Antonio when I worked there for years in South Texas, in order for them to get out of state, there are, you know, they would have to drive 10 hours each way. They would have to find childcare. They would, I mean, that's difficult for anybody, but imagine the patient who's in an unsafe, abusive relationship where she doesn't have control over anything in her life, even her own body. I mean, it's so hard to imagine her getting out of state to obtain an abortion. And that means that, you know, many survivors will end up having to continue a pregnancy.
You mentioned that you used to practice in Southern Texas. You moved to Montana just before the court overturned Roe versus Wade. Why did you move?
You know, I trained for many years to become a physician and an abortion provider. And it's an absolute privilege to be able to provide those services to patients. And my family and I knew that I wouldn't be able to do that after the Dobbs decision was made. It was very clear that Texas was going to ban all abortions. And so it was a very difficult decision.
Dr. Samuel Dickman, Chief Medical Officer for Planned Parenthood of Montana. Thank you very much, Doctor.
Thank you, John.
So nearly 65,000 rape-related pregnancies are likely to occur in the 14 US states, with near total abortion bans following the US Supreme Court's 2022 Dobbs decision. Yet just 10 legal abortions are performed monthly on average in these states, researchers found in a new analysis. The data demonstrates that abortion bans likely make it impossible for most victims of rape to obtain abortions in their home states, even for the minority of people who live in states with exemptions for rape, researchers said. So rape is extremely traumatic, and this is something that Dr. Cerizier's article discusses, and it's something that many scholars have talked about, that the trauma of rape or sexual violence cannot be just kind of undone or also recounted in clear factual statements. Often when one is traumatized, they can remember parts of the trauma at different times. The narrative does not really come in a clear line. Like if you remember things that were traumatic in life or traumatic life events, you might not remember them clearly. You might remember pieces. And this is why narrating trauma is very hard. It's also why reacting to trauma right away can be extremely difficult. So if one is raped and then needs to have an abortion, someone might not react by even moving to a different state or trying to go to a different state or contacting people to try to see if they're family members or friends or people who are part of the feminist movement who would help someone go to a different state. Trauma often has this kind of reaction that is quite sporadic, and it's why Tanya Cerizier thinks that narratives of rape are sometimes hard for people to believe if they were actually just to read them as accounts that are supposed to be sort of perfect and timely narratives told in a sequential manner. And it is interesting to think about rape narratives in relation to Halberstam's writings about queer temporalities and time, that the idea of time and time being clearly demarcated with beginning, middle, and end is obviously interrupted by traumatic events, and traumatic events which people often do not want to believe happen, despite the statistical likelihood of rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment. The large numbers of estimated rape-related pregnancies and abortion ban states compared with the 10 or fewer legal abortions per month occurring in each of those states indicates that persons who have been raped and become pregnant cannot access legal abortions in their home state, even in states with rape exceptions. And this is from a letter that was written in the journal JAMA Internal Medicine. So this article has been published about rape and abortion, and following this ruling to overturn Roe versus Wade, an estimated 5,586 rape-related pregnancies occurred in states with exceptions for for the victims of rape, although not all women who become pregnant from a rape want an abortion. Those who do are likely confronted with the reality that their state offers no access to abortion. So researchers found that even states with exemptions are likely to fail providing any meaningful opportunity to terminate a pregnancy. The analysis stopped short of estimating the number of women who might have been forced to carry a rape-related pregnancy to term. And so this happened in 2022, and so now it's 2024. So in the future, there will have to be, and there will obviously be more research done about the effects of this ruling and about pregnancies after rape. So this article then discusses Nazism and abortion. Sorry, it is an article. I've done two kinds of research. Firstly, this article from The Guardian is about the Dobbs ruling, and this article is about actually Nazism and abortion and the relationship between fascism, the building of ethnically pure nation states, rape, and abortion. So in 1930, on March 12th, the Nazi Party delegates to Reichstag foreshadowed the future when they offered a bill designed to extend paragraph 218. Whoever undertakes to artificially block the natural fertility of the German Volk to the detriment of the German nation, or promote such endeavors by word, publication, picture, or any other means, or who by mixing with members of the Jewish blood community or colored races contributes to the racial deterioration and decomposition of the German Volk, or threatens to contribute to such endeavors, will be punished with a penitentiary sentence for treason. So racial and religious and national treason was central to the Nazi Party and to the Third Reich's programs. And if one wanted to have an abortion, they could actually be criminalized for treason by the Nazis in the 1930s. So having a child was forced because if you were to give birth to a white German child, then you were supporting the white race. And this program also involved then forcing Jewish women with disabilities, and other women who were deemed to be unfit to have children for the white race, to I guess, have abortions or sterilizing certain groups of women. And this program was called eugenics. And there's a long history of eugenic medicine that was used by the Nazis. Canada has an ongoing set of class action lawsuits against nurses in Canada who are accused of sterilizing Indigenous women and girls without their consent. And this can also be seen to be an act of eugenics. So by 1933, racial hygiene was taught in most medical schools and by medical scientists. So even if they did not fully embrace Nazi racism, welcome the opportunity of translating their intrinsically theoretical research into government policy. Eugenics was to merge with racial hygiene, becoming the central core of Nazi population policies. So the election of Donald Trump and the rise of neo-Nazism and the use of the swastika, even in kind of white nationalist speeches and even in certain schools, was really terrifying. And I think that efforts to ban abortion are also really disturbing. Canada has comprehensive abortion laws. You can get an abortion in Canada. And I hope that people will think about belief and who they believe and why they believe who they believe. And I'll finish with this quote, which you can read, which was written by the late Andrea Dworkin. Feminism is hated because women are hated. So that is all. And next week we have reading week. I hope that you are enjoying the recorded lectures. You can also contact me if you would like to meet over Zoom and talk about the assignments or the expectations for the course. The presentation, your recorded 10-minute presentation, is due after reading week. So please try to upload the presentation online after reading week. Thank you, and I hope you have a nice break, and I hope that you are doing well. Goodbye.